Tonight's program is called The Road to Concord, How 4 Stolen Cannon Ignited the Revolutionary War, by this gentleman here, Mr. Bell. Now, we have books for sale up back if you're interested in purchasing one. This is his book that he'll be talking about tonight. They're $22. We have a limited number up there. I think we have maybe about 20 or 25. And you said you had some extras. The Road to Concord explores a fresh dimension of the start of America's war for independence. At the heart of this history are 4 small brass cannon stolen from militia armories in Boston. They were smuggled out of town to the countryside and finally located by royal spies in Concord. The Patriots and General Gage both had reasons to keep those guns out of their public reports on the start of the war, meaning this story has never really been told before. Mr. Bell is a Massachusetts writer who specializes in the start of the American Revolution in and around Boston. He's been elected a fellow of the Massachusetts Historical Society, a fellow of the American Antiquarian Society, and a member of the Colonial Society of Massachusetts. We will be bypassing curators and treasury reports and whatever because of a little more limited time. So I will present you to Mr. Bell. Next month, we will have a meeting on the 28th of February. It will be back at our home. The speaker will be Tom Keller of Old Sturbridge Village. He's always willing to come and share information with us. And this one here, this program will be a brief history of medicine in the early 19th century. We've got refreshments up back. Enjoy, Mr. Bell. Have a lovely evening.
Thank you. Thank you to Linda and Chris and all the folks at the Shrewsbury Historical Society, especially whoever made those chocolate chip cookies back there. They're very nice indeed. I'm going to tell a story that runs through my book, The Road to Concord, about how I'm going to try this. Is this going to be better? All right, thank you. I'm going to tell a story about a story that runs through The Road to Concord, about the arms race, the literal race for weaponry in pre-revolutionary New England. And I'll start by reading a passage from the journal of this man, the Reverend Dr. Ezra Stiles of Newport, Rhode Island. He recorded the experience of a young Irish merchant named McNeil, who had traveled on business east through Massachusetts to Boston, and had described what he experienced in the small, rural New England town of Shrewsbury. He went to bed without hearing anything. But about midnight, or perhaps 1 o'clock, he was suddenly waked up, somebody violently rapping up the landlord, telling the doleful story that the powder was taken, 6 men killed, and the people between there and Boston arming and marching down to the relief of their brethren at Boston. And within a quarter of an hour, he judges, 50 men were collected at the tavern, though now deep at night, equipping themselves and sending off posts every way to the neighboring towns. The men set off as fast as they were equipped. In the morning, Mr. McNeil rode forward and passed through the hole at the very time of the convulsion. He said he'd never seen such a scene before. All along were armed men rushing forward, some on foot, some on horseback. At every house, women and children making cartridges, running bullets, making wallets, baking biscuit, crying and bemoaning, and at the same time animating their husbands and sons to fight for their liberties, though not knowing whether they should ever see them again. All this and an activity corresponding with such emotions appeared all along the whole tract, about 40 miles from Shrewsbury to Boston. Now that scene should sound familiar, almost iconic. It's how American culture remembers the alarm just during the Battle of Lexington and Concord in April 19th, 1775. But that was the subject of innumerable 19th century prints like this one. But Mr. McNeil was describing an event on September 2nd, 1774. He witnessed an armed uprising in central Massachusetts against the royal government of London more than 7 months before the Revolutionary War officially began. Usually our national origin story doesn't include much military activity before Lexington and Concord. Instead, we talk about the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia. We talk about the Committees of Correspondence and the Suffolk Resolves and other political activity. But during that time, most of New England was preparing for war. And this talk is about what followed that uprising in September 1774 and what I call the arms race. This is a New England story, not only because it happened in New England, but because it could only happen in New England. The 4 colonies of New England were not like Britain's other 22 colonies in the Americas. The original British settlers in New England were separatists, Puritans, dissenters outside the Church of England. Those descendants became what we now call Congregationalists. These people still distrusted the Church of England. Within the British Empire, New England was basically a society of religious zealots. This was the only place that still thought it was actually a pretty good idea to kill King Charles I and put Oliver Cromwell in charge. Congregationalists and other dissenting congregations chose their own ministers. They were used to voting on leaders. They were used to voting on policy. It was a bottom-up, not top-down type of religion. And the same applied to New England's civil life. Towns were governed by town meetings. Once a year, they elected officials, their selectmen and other town officials. New Englanders elected both houses of their legislature. In Connecticut and Rhode Island, they even elected their governors. In every other colony, the government in London appointed the governors and the upper house of the legislature. In New York City was a city with a mayor appointed by the governor who was appointed by the government in London. Out in the New York countryside, the big landlords dominated. So it was a very different, more top-down society. All of the colonial governments had some combination of top-down and bottom-up authority, but, or I might better say, I've been saying bottom-up, really I might be better off saying middle-up, because of course it was the white men with enough property who were able to vote. In New England, that balance was more middle-up. But in 1774, that situation changed. The government in London responded to a particular event, the Boston Tea Party of December 16, 1773. Bostonians threw more than 9,000 pounds worth of tea into the harbor. To be exact, in fact, hundreds of Bostonians watched while about 5 or 6 dozen men threw all that tea into the harbor, and not a single witness came forward to identify any of those things. So it was really a collective action. The government in London had already been trying to strengthen its control over the colonies since the end of the last war. In 1767, Parliament beefed up the Customs Service, a top-down, all-appointed from London agency. Parliament had granted salaries to top appointees, insulating them from bottom-up pressure. And after the Boston Tea Party, the imperial government really cracked down on New England, or especially Boston and Massachusetts, with the coercive acts. And the man in charge of implementing those acts was this man, General Thomas Gage. He was the commander-in-chief of the British Army in North America. He had lived in America for decades. He had married an American woman. And in 1774, the king and Parliament were convinced that this was the man who would be able to bring order back to New England. Gage brought a couple more army regiments to Boston in May when he took over the governor's job. Those soldiers were there to patrol the town, to keep the port closed to trade. And instead of summoning the legislature to Boston, as usual, he summoned them to Salem, up north, per orders from London. Parliament did some other things to try to formally limit Massachusetts' bottom-up government with the Massachusetts Government Act. Town meetings. You could only have one town meeting a year unless you had got prior approval by the governor under the new law. The council, the governor's council, which was the top house of the legislature, that was now going to be appointed from London instead of elected locally. And critics called the result the Mandamus Council because it was people were summoned by writs of mandamus, or the newfangled council. Very unpopular. The Massachusetts Government Act arrived in Salem in August. Gage started swearing in the new councilors there, and the people of Massachusetts didn't like it. In their eyes, now, the crown had encroached on nearly every form of self-government. So Massachusetts' elected politicians responded with resistance. The legislature sent men to the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia, and in return, the governor dissolved the legislature. The town meetings, they kept going by adjournment. They were saying, oh, this isn't a new town meeting. This is our old town meeting. We've just adjourned to a new date. The law never said they couldn't do that. The Massachusetts Government Act said you couldn't have town meetings without permission. You couldn't have province-wide, colony-wide meetings. The law didn't say anything about county meetings. So they started to have county meetings, starting out in Berkshire County on July 1774. And then Worcester committees of correspondence met on August 6, 1774. And at the end of August, the Hampshire County Convention. So this movement of county conventions was moving eastward across the state. And there was even more popular resistance on the county court day. The Berkshire County Court was to meet in Great Barrington on August 16th, and hundreds of unarmed militiamen turned out and insisted that the justices not meet. And this shows how important the colonial militia was. It wasn't just a matter of the guns, because they were not bringing their guns. It was a matter of their organization. It was a matter of their coherence. It was a vitally important institution. It was the emergency military force, distinct from the regular military, Army and Navy, reporting to London. It was the bottom-up army. It was self-government in action. Militia service was required for almost all white men between ages of 16 and 60, and in practice, we can look at the records and we can see more black men and Native Americans participating as well. Companies elected their own sergeants, lieutenants, and captains. So again, bottom-up organization. It was an avenue for proving oneself, to be successful, to be respected in your town militia, and it was a ladder for social climbing, because if you could show your neighbors that you were good as a sergeant, you might get to be lieutenant, you might get to be captain. At a certain level, you're high enough that people are going to start calling you a gentleman. So the militia command was, now the governor appointed the colonels. He was supposed to be in charge. He was the so-called captain general of the militia. So the militia was also a combination of top-down and bottom-up organization, but really the militia was more bottom-up, because if the militia didn't want to turn out, there was no way to get the turnout because there was no other force. In 1747 in Boston, during the Stamp Act riots of 1765, the governor was looking at all those disturbances, and he went to his council and said, oh, we've got to call out the militia. And the council looked at him and said, you know all those men out in the street? Those are the militia. And here in Great Barrington, in August 1774, militia companies turned out without their guns, but probably in their companies, lined up in formation in front of the courthouse, and gave the message to the justices of the peace that no, you were not going to meet under the new Massachusetts Government Act. The same thing happened at Springfield in Hampshire County on August 30th. At the same time, crowds were going to the houses of councilors who were living in this part of Massachusetts and intimidating most of them into not taking their seat on the newfangled council. Meanwhile, General Gage was having trouble with the local government back in Salem, so he finally gave up and moved himself and his staff to Boston, where most of his troops were. And from Boston, Gage decided that to minimize the threat from the countryside, starting with this site, the Provincial Powder House. This was then in West Charlestown. It's now in the city of Somerville. It held gunpowder owned by the province and by town militia companies. And a general in the militia told Gage that the towns had removed all their stock of powder. So the rest, all the gunpowder that was left in this tower belonged to General Gage, or it was under his authority as Captain General of the militia. And he decided that it would be better off to take it and make sure that it stayed under his control. He wrote out orders for a mission on September 1st, 1774. Before dawn, 280 soldiers marched from Boston Common to the Long Wharf, which is, let's see, am I getting any water? To the Long Wharf. Between 4 and 5 in the morning, they clambered into boats. Navy sailors rowed those men up around Boston to the Mystic River. They landed on the dock of a Loyalist farm. They marched overland to the Powder House. Soldiers arrived at the Powder House before dawn on September 1st. They waited until twilight grew a little brighter, because you don't want to take a lantern into a gunpowder storage house. They even took off their boots before going inside so they wouldn't knock any sparks. The nails on their boots wouldn't cause sparks on the stone floor. And they moved 250 half barrels of gunpowder from that tower into 8 wagons. Meanwhile, 20 soldiers proceeded on into Cambridge. They met the sheriff of Middlesex County. He turned over the county militia artillery company's 2 small cannon. This is part of the militia, but it was a part that was specialized to fire these cannon. Some locals tried to stop them, but they couldn't get organized. Soldiers took all the ordnance to Castle William, a fortified island, which was under the Army's control, which meant that now all the gunpowder and the cannons from the Middlesex County militia were in the completely under the Royal Army's control. The operation took fewer than 300 soldiers. It went smoothly. There was no resistance. It was over by midday. Gage felt so confident that later that day he announced new elections. The people could elect another legislature in Salem. He felt safe. However, to the populace, the removal of the powder and the cannon looked like a strike at their militia system. This was the last branch of self-government was still functioning free of royal control. And what's more, the rumors about what had happened that day were even worse than what had actually happened. In Hartford, people heard at Cambridge, a high Tory had petitioned Gage for troops to protect him at his house, which Gage granted. A mob gathered and demanded of the militia general to renounce his Toryism, or whatever you may term it. But after a short parley, the troop fired, killed some outright, and a large number wounded. So in Hartford, they were hearing about a second Boston massacre. By the time the alarm reached Longmeadow, Massachusetts, the story was that the ships in the harbor of Boston and the army on the land side were also firing upon the town, and that it was like the town was demolished. And that was also what the merchant, Mr. McNeil, heard in Shrewsbury soon after midnight on September 2nd. So that is why men in Massachusetts started to gather in their militia companies and march toward Cambridge, because they thought that their colony was now under attack from the royal government. And this is how the radical Boston Gazette spun the story. From these several hostile appearances, the county of Middlesex took the alarm, and on Thursday evening the 1st began to collect in large bodies with their arms, provisions, and ammunition, determining by some means to give a check to the power which so openly threatened their destruction, and in such a clandestine manner robbed them of the means of their defense. And the Boston merchant, John Andrews, said they had an account at Marlborough of the powders being removed last Thursday night, yet they were down to Cambridge, which is 30 miles, by 8 o'clock Friday morning, with a troop of horse and another of foot. So there were soldiers, militia soldiers, pouring into Cambridge. At 8 o'clock, said John Andrews, there were about 3,000 under their regular leaders at Cambridge Common, and continually increasing. By regular leaders, he meant the militia officers. They advanced to Cambridge, armed only with sticks, as they had left their firearms, etc., at some distance behind them, said the Boston Gazette. So once again, they were organized like the militia, they were not fully armed, because they realized as they reached Cambridge that the town was not in flames, Boston was not being massacred, there was no shooting, but they kept coming to make a political point. The towns to the west had intimidated many of the newfangled councilors into resigning their seats. So the crowd in Cambridge decided to do the same. They sent for the councilors who lived in Cambridge and other officials to meet them on the common. The Cambridge Committee of Correspondence was worried that there would come to violence. They were worried that there would be possible retaliation from General Gage coming out of Boston. So they sat down with the leaders of these new arrivals, of these 3,000, 4,000 men, and the two councilors, and they worked out a compromise, an arrangement. The men both said they resigned. They resigned in writing. They went in front of this crowd on the Cambridge Common and resigned then. The the Charlestown Committee of Correspondence also came to help the crowd, and even some of the leading patriots in Boston came out to help. Dr. Joseph Warren here reported later to Samuel Adams, who was in Philadelphia for the Continental Congress, a billet was brought requesting me to take some step to prevent the people from coming to immediate acts of violence, as incredible numbers were in arms and lined the roads from Sudbury to Cambridge. And so half a dozen activists set out across the ferry, and on their way, Warren said, we met with the Lieutenant Governor, Thomas Oliver. He said he was going to the general and to desire him not to march his troops out of Boston. We thought his precaution good and proceeded to Cambridge. Lieutenant Governor Oliver of Cambridge had made a deal with the leaders of the crowd there. He would go into Boston and ask Gage not to try to put down this unrest, not to try to attack the people, and then he would come back out, and in return, the people out in Cambridge promised to be peaceful. All these upper-class gentlemen the selectmen of Charlestown, the selectmen of Cambridge, the Patriots of Boston, Lieutenant Governor Oliver, they were trying to calm the farmers who were coming in from the west, not to rile them up. It was ironic because the Boston Whigs had spent years trying to get the countryside riled up, and now they were riled up, and the same people were going out there and saying, well, you really have to calm down. By the time the Boston Whigs arrived on Cambridge Common, the councilors were resigning. The Bostonians went up to the front, and naturally they tried to take charge. One of them tried to treat the gathering like a town meeting. A vote was called for, says the Boston Gazette, to see if the body was satisfied with the declarations and resignations above said, and passed in the affirmative nem con, which means no dissenting voices. It was then moved to know whether the body would signify their abhorrence of riots, mobs, and the destruction of private property, and passed in the affirmative nem con. 4,000 men, some of them holding sticks, saying, oh yeah, we're totally against political violence. And then the committees all sat down in a tavern with the militia officers in the crowd and decided what to do with the sheriff who had turned over the militia cannon. And he had to apologize for sending out writs under the Massachusetts Government Act. And then Lieutenant Governor Thomas Oliver came back from Boston. They had to decide what to do about him. They asked him, okay, would you resign from the council as well? And he said, well, that wasn't part of the deal we made. I went in, I got General Gage not to send troops out. He promised to consider resigning if the need arose. That seemed satisfactory to the committee, said the Boston Gazette, and they were preparing to deliver it to the body, the thousands of men, but then something happened to inflame the people. 3 customs commissioners rode through Cambridge on their way from Salem, where they had been working, to Boston. The same officials who had been collecting those new taxes since 1767. Isaiah Thomas, the young printer of the Massachusetts Spy, pointed out the least popular of these commissioners riding by. According to this commissioner, Benjamin Hallowell, no insult or affront was offered to me until I came to where some people from Boston stood, who called out to me, "Ah, damn you, how do you like us now, you Tory son of a bitch?" And the Boston Gazette said, the sight of that obnoxious person so inflamed the people that in a few minutes above 60 horsemen were drawn up and proceeding in pursuit of him on the full gallop. Some of the committee men convinced some of those horsemen to stop, but a few continued to chase the customs commissioner. They chased him across the bridge from Cambridge through Roxbury all the way to the gates of Boston, which was guarded by British troops. Meanwhile, back on Cambridge Common, a rumor spread that now definitely the soldiers were going to come out. The commissioner was going to have Gage send out the soldiers. The crowd sent out some of their light horsemen, i.e. the guys on horseback, which ordinarily we'd think of as guys on horseback, but they were already thinking in military terms, light horsemen, to scout the roads. And the riders came back with news that no soldiers were on their way, but the crowd was now all fired up, and who was left in town but Lieutenant Governor Thomas Oliver. The crowd replaced their first leaders with more confrontational men, and they marched out to Oliver's house late in the afternoon, and they caught him just as he was preparing to go back into Boston, because he was no fool. He knew that there were 4,000 men in town who were upset at him. Hundreds of men surrounded his estate. Some had now gone back for their guns. Oliver refused to cooperate. Some men came closer, peering through the open windows. Oliver could hear his wife and young daughters upstairs crying. All the leaders were pleading with Oliver to just resign, as the crowd demanded. And finally, Lieutenant Governor Oliver took the resignation they had written out and wrote at the bottom, "My house at Cambridge being surrounded by about 4,000 people, in compliance with their command, I sign my name, Thomas Oliver." Meanwhile, there were still more rumors spreading inside Boston. John Andrews, the merchant, said 4 or 5 expresses have come down to Charlestown and here to acquaint us that between Sudbury and this, above 10,000 men are in arms and continually coming down from the country back. That their determination is to collect about 40 or 50,000 by night, which they are sure of accomplishing, when they intend to fling about 15,000 by way of the neck. By way of the neck, and more over the ferry, which once they got possession, to come in like locusts and rid the town of every soldier. And only one force was strong enough to put an end to this confrontation: the weather. According to Deacon John Tudor's diary, at 5 p.m. came on hard thunder and lightning with a great shower, and the thousands of men headed home. But that confrontation in Boston on September 2nd, in Cambridge on September 2nd, made clear that this wasn't just a matter of riotous Bostonians anymore. Gage told his boss, Secretary of State Lord Dartmouth, on that day, "Though I saw things were bad when I wrote from Salem, I found them much worse than I expected when I arrived here in Boston. Though the people are not held in high estimation by the troops, yet they are numerous, worked up to a fury. They are not a Boston rabble, but the freeholders and farmers of the country. For years, royal appointees had believed that a small faction of malcontents in Boston were getting everybody else riled up. But now they realized that however it happened, many more people, the bulk of people in Massachusetts, this large majority of rural farmers, were more radical than the Boston leaders. And they were no longer respecting the traditional authority of royal appointees. The authority of the royal government now stopped at the gates of Boston. General Gage had troops in Boston and at Castle William. He had no power to enforce obedience anywhere else in Massachusetts. And in fact, New England was no longer inclined to respect his authority or the king's authority through these governors. Most of the rural population, 90% or so, had adopted the idea that it was absolutely necessary to resist the Massachusetts Government Act. When men massed in their militia companies, that's how they were supposed to respond. That's how the system was supposed to work. That they were responding to an emergency to defend their society. And in fact, it worked so well that militia companies were still mobilizing 3 days after the powder alarm, because the corrective messages that no, Boston had not been destroyed, no, there wasn't a massacre happening, those took time to spread out after the initial rumors. So in Pomfret, Connecticut, Israel Putnam heard about the Royal Artillery shelling Boston around 11 a.m. on Saturday. And he sent off letters to all his counterparts in the Connecticut militia. And handbills repeating Putnam's alarm arrived in New Haven on Sunday. And by Monday, September 5th, word of the trouble had reached New York. And the commander of the British troops there wrote to General Gage asking if he needed help. And on Tuesday, the Continental Congress in Philadelphia heard about the intimation of the bombardment of Boston, as John Adams wrote. So probably, however briefly, 20,000 New England militiamen mobilized in the beginning of September 1774. That was a whole army's worth of men. That afternoon, as General Gage was trying to keep control or get control back of the situation, the first thing he did is he canceled the elections, he called. Not that anyone paid any attention to him. He also responded by increasing the defenses of Boston. The Royal Navy moved their men of war around the town. He stationed cannon on the neck and started to fortify the gate there. He was defending himself against the people he was supposed to govern. On September 4th, he summoned the 10th and 52nd Regiment down from Quebec. On September 5th, he summoned all the troops he had in New York. He was flooding the town with as many soldiers as he could. Out in Worcester, there was supposed to be a court session for this county on September 6th. It didn't happen. Militia companies from 37 towns turned out to make sure. An observer counted 4,722 men in all. They lined Main Street. They demanded that every royal appointee promise not to act under the new laws. And underneath all these political protests, there were also military preparations. It started back on September 2nd, the day of what was called the powder alarm. Towns like Brookline held meetings to discuss their military supplies and training. Men wanted to be able to defend themselves in case the royal forces really did attack. And they also felt that by showing that they could defend themselves, they would deter the royal government from trying an attack. But of course, to General Gage, all that preparation for military action looked like a threat. And he warned Lord Dartmouth on September 12th, "The country people are exercising in arms in this province, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, and getting magazines of arms and ammunition in the country, and such artillery as they can procure, good and bad." By artillery, Gage meant cannon, the most advanced battlefield weapons of the time. Massachusetts militia companies had a few small cannon that they had trained on. Gage's soldiers had taken 2 back from the Middlesex County militia on September 1st. There were also cannon around Boston in shore batteries. Up in Charlestown, north of Boston, the battery contained 5 cannon, 18-pounders, meaning that they could fire cannonballs that weighed 18 pounds. And they were up against the shore, pointing out at the harbor to prevent, if the French or Spanish got that far into the harbor, to guard against them getting any further. By September 7th, Gage learned the locals had hauled all those cannon in Charlestown away. They were reportedly hidden on the town's schoolhouse hill under what an 1845 historian termed stable dirt. People in Dorchester, south of Boston, followed Charlestown's example. On September 12th, Samuel Pierce of Dorchester recorded in his diary, "The great gun was removed from Preston's Point at the mouth of the Neponset River." General Gage had sent officers to Charlestown to investigate where the cannon went. Locals got nervous, so they gathered teams, the same sorts of oxen teams or horse teams that they used for hauling ships' masts, and they moved all those cannon further inland, out of the Redcoats' reach. Boston itself had 2 batteries at the north and south end of the central harbor. In 1770, those batteries contained 22 cannon between them. The Royal Artillery was already using the South Battery, so that was out of the locals' control, but the North Battery was still under the control of the local militia. But on the night of Wednesday, September 14th, sailors from the Royal Navy entered the North Battery from the water and spiked all the guns inside, rendering them useless until they were repaired. And in addition, the Boston Postboy reported that the cannon in the batteries back of Governor's Island in Boston Harbor were removed by the general's order. Now, those actions by the Royal Navy and the military were meant to allow the Royal Navy to operate in the harbor without any danger from being fired upon by the locals using those cannon. So they had made Boston Harbor much more safe for the Royal Navy. But that wasn't all that happened that night. Boston also had 2 small gun houses or armories near the center of town. This is the builder's sketch of one of them. They were about the size, I think, of a 2-car garage. Each gun house had 2 small cannon on carriages made for battlefield use. They were called field guns. Those guns were used by the Boston's militia artillery company, which was called the Train. The man in charge of that company leaned toward the Crown. All the other officers and most of the men leaned towards the Patriots. General Gage did not want to lose control of those 4 field pieces, so he ordered a double guard on the new and old gun houses. And on the morning of September 15th, after the Royal Navy had done all that with the South Battery and so on, the next morning the troops found that there was a small opening in the side of the old gun house, and the 2 small brass cannon inside were gone. Naturally, General Gage put an even bigger stronger guard in front of the new gun house. That site was already seemed quite secure. It was right beside Boston Common, where the 4th Regiment was camped. The commander of the Train had the only key to this building. But even that situation didn't seem quite secure enough to General Gage. So on Friday, September 16th, 1774, Royal Artillery officers asked for the gun house key. The officer brought a squad to move the 2 cannon from inside this building into the British Army camp. But when that squad opened the gun house, the guns were gone. All 4 of the Boston Train's field guns had disappeared. There were other conflicts over cannon inside Boston in September 1774. On the 20th, a boat carrying iron cannon ran aground in the river, and the Royal Navy seized those weapons. At the end of the month, there was a big confrontation over the stock of a hardware merchant named Joseph Scott. The Royal Artillery forced him to sell all his ordnance to them. To show their displeasure, that night some people emptied the contents of an outhouse into Mr. Scott's windows, and he went into hiding. And that night, Dr. Joseph Warren went to General Gage to complain. The doctor asked, "What is the meaning that the general buys military stores?" And the Gage reportedly replied, "The country people were all armed and collecting cannon and military stores from all quarters, which could indicate nothing but their intention of attacking His Majesty's forces in this town. It is notorious that many cannon have been conveyed from thence, and arms are carried out openly by every man that goes out of Boston without molestation." Gage tried to alert his superiors in London about this dangerous situation. On September 25th, he wrote to the Secretary of War, Viscount Barrington, "The New England provinces are, I may say, in arms, and the question is not now whether you shall quell disturbances in Boston, but whether those provinces shall be conquered. From appearances, no people are more determined for a civil war. The whole country, from hence to New York, armed, training, and providing military stores." But General Gage didn't tell his superiors how Bostonians had managed to sneak 4 brass cannon out from under his own nose in a town with thousands of troops. That probably, telling them that probably wouldn't have helped his standing in London. As it turned out, the ministers there thought he was overreacting, so they didn't send much help. The people of Massachusetts went ahead with those elections that General Gage had called off. They voted for a new Massachusetts legislature, which met in early October, and was basically a shadow government called the Massachusetts Provincial Congress. It met first in Salem, then it adjourned to Concord, keeping it beyond General Gage's easy reach. This sort of provincial Congress, this colony-wide legislature, was specifically forbidden by the Massachusetts Government Act. And yet more towns participated in the provincial Congress than participated in a usual legal legislature. That was how strong the movement was. Soon that Congress assumed the powers of government, taxation, military preparation. It reorganized the militia, purging officers who were thought to be loyal to the crown. It stepped up military training. On October 25th, the Congress committee drew up a military budget that called for 20 field pieces and 4 mortars. The Congress formed a committee of safety and a committee of supplies to equip their army. Those committees voted in November to start collecting cannon out in the countryside. So as of the fall of 1774, the Massachusetts Provincial Congress was clearly preparing for war. Now this was all about 2 months after the people themselves began grabbing all the cannon they could get and all the powder, but it was well before what we think of as the beginning of the war. And in December, this arms race to control artillery spread outside Massachusetts. The Rhode Island Assembly voted to remove almost all the guns from Fort George off Newport. 5 days later, the people of New London, Connecticut moved their cannon into the country. And people started to wonder about New Hampshire, where Fort William and Mary guarded the Portsmouth harbor, and there were lots of cannon in a nice harbor fort. Bostonians saw signs that the Royal Navy was about to send a ship up there to take control of that site and the ordnance. So Paul Revere rode 60 miles on icy roads to warn the New Hampshire Patriots. Militiamen stormed Fort William and Mary, overwhelming the captain and 6 soldiers inside, and they seized most of the gunpowder and took it away until the mainland. 2 days later, the political leaders of New Hampshire, the Continental Congress delegates, came back into town, and they looked around and they said, "Oh," and they went to the fort and took away all the cannon. Gage realized that the crown had now lost control of almost all of New England. The other governors were either powerless or on the Patriots' side. The London government was not going to be sending him any help. But to his credit, General Gage didn't give up. He started an effort to infiltrate the Patriot movement in Massachusetts. On February 21st, 1775, the Committee of Safety and Supplies met in Charlestown, and they decided they had enough cannon to start organizing artillery companies as part of their army. On that same February 21st, according to documents in his files, General Gage suddenly got a lot more information about the Patriots' military. There are in the country 38 field pieces and 19 companies of artillery, Gage wrote. General Gage had made a deal for information with a new committee member, Dr. Benjamin Church, Jr. of Boston. Church was at the highest level of the Whig movement in Boston for years. We don't have an authentic picture of Church, but I'm showing a bit of a ciphered letter that he sent to a British Army officer later in 1775. Thanks to communications like this from Dr. Church, Gage knew where most of the provincial Congress's guns were. They were in Worcester. There were a few in Watertown. There were a few at Concord and some in Salem, including pieces of brass cannon. Brass cannon. General Gage was looking for brass cannon, the brass cannon stolen from Boston. Armed with the information from Dr. Church, the general made new plans. Back in early January, Gage had asked Army officers capable of taking sketches of the country to contact his office, and 2 officers came forward. Captain William Brown of the 52nd Regiment and Ensign Henry de Bernier of the 10th. And on February 22nd, the day after receiving his first intelligence from Dr. Church, the general wrote out instructions for those 2 officers. They were to hike out into the Massachusetts countryside in civilian clothing as far as Worcester County, taking notes on roads, towns, passes, fords, and other geographic features. Gage told Brown and de Bernier that he expected to have occasion to march troops through the country the following spring. The 2 officers left Boston on February 23rd with an enlisted man as a servant. By midday, they had got as far as Watertown, a couple of towns to the west. During their dinner there, a black woman told Brown and de Bernier that she recognized them as British Army officers from Boston. So their cover was completely blown. But they understood that it was absolutely necessary to push on to Worcester, so they continued west. Meanwhile, Gage had received more information from Dr. Church. In particular, the physician relayed, "There are 8 field pieces in an old store or barn near the landing place at Salem. They are to be removed in a few days. The seizure of them would greatly disconcert their schemes." Did those cannon in Salem include the brass guns stolen out of the Boston gun houses? If they were, and Gage wanted those back, he had to act quickly. So Gage ordered an expedition to Salem. Late on Saturday, February 25th, Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Leslie and 240 men sailed from Castle William in Boston Harbor. Their ship docked in Marblehead early on Sunday morning. The soldiers stayed below decks until most of the people went into their meeting. Then the troops disembarked and started to march through town toward Salem. Now, in fact, a painter named David Mason was living in Salem and working for the Massachusetts Committee of Safety. He had collected about 12 old iron cannon. A blacksmith was mounting them on carriages, on wheels, at a shop in the north of the town, across the North River. Somebody came to his meeting house and told him that there were soldiers on the way. So Mason raced out of the meeting house towards the blacksmith shop, and he started to move the cannon to a wooded area a mile further. And he pulled up a drawbridge across the North River between his meeting house and the forge. Lieutenant Colonel Leslie and his men arrived, guided by local loyalists. They could see the smithy they were supposed to search, but they couldn't get across the water because the bridge was up. There was some yelling, there was some shoving. Militia companies were gathering in nearby towns and starting to march towards Salem. After nearly 90 minutes with the sun going down, the minister of a nearby church negotiated a compromise. Mason, who by this time knew most of his cannon were safe, promised that he would let down the bridge. Leslie pledged his honor he would not march above 30 rods beyond it and then immediately return, following his orders to the letter, but not looking for cannon nearby. And that's what happened. The 64th Regiment stepped across the channel, turned around, and walked back through Salem to Marblehead and on their ships, and all the militia companies watched and marched at a distance. And on March 3rd, a week later, the local Essex Gazette reported, 27 pieces of cannon were removed out of this town in order to be out of the way of robbers. So whatever cannon were in Salem were now being moved to be safer in the countryside. Meanwhile, Captain Brown and Ensign de Bernier were still out in central Massachusetts. That very Sunday, they were in Worcester, sketching maps of the roads and taking notes on what they had seen, and 2 men came to the tavern where they were staying and said they knew that they were strangers, that these guys were Army's officers. So they headed east. They left Worcester the next morning. Eventually, these officers had to trudge back to Boston through a snowstorm. So that was the end of General Gage's first spy mission. But not everything was going so smoothly for the Patriots either. On February 23rd, the Committee of Safety had voted to send 2 cannon to each of the men in charge of 6 militia regiments. And one of those men was Artemus Ward, a militia general from Shrewsbury. 4 days later, he wrote back that he had chosen men for an artillery company, but no one was available to teach them how to handle cannon. There is a person in this town who understands the exercise, Ward said, but has of late discovered such sentiments in political matters that I dare not trust him. So both sides were becoming more and more suspicious, more and more worried about what the other was up to. Around this time, General Gage developed another intelligence source out in the Massachusetts countryside. That person lived at Concord and communicated by letter. He or she wrote most of the time in terrible French, probably to ensure that people, if they intercepted the letter, most people would not be able to read it. And the spy's message on April 8th said, among other things, that 4 brass cannon and 2 mortars, so called by the peasantry, conceal that Mr. B lately chose or appointed minute colonel, supposed to be deposited in his cellar. The 4 brass cannon were the guns from Boston. The Patriots had smuggled them out of Boston. They stayed for a while at a tavern in Dorchester, and then they moved them out to Concord. Gage's spy reported on other iron cannon in the Concord courthouse, and more just arrived from another town. The man in charge of those guns was Mr. B, lately chose or appointed minute colonel. Well, that was James Barrett, a 65-year-old farmer and provincial Congress delegate who lived in Concord. This is his house. Barrett kept an account of the military stores he was collecting in Concord, and that list exactly matches what the spy reported. 4 brass cannon, 10 iron cannon, 2 mortars. Barrett had neighbors storing other supplies for the Committee of Safety: musket cartridges, musket balls, gunpowder, entrenching tools, medical chests, tents, tent poles, dishes and spoons, and 4 barrels of oatmeal containing 20 bushels. So he was creating the supplies for an army. On March 11th, the same spy reported on a trip to Worcester that he, or she, saw cannon outside a church, mounted poorly on carriages, but that report ended, the brass cannon veritably are now at Concord. And those brass guns were what Gage was most interested in. Gage ordered Captain Brown and Ensign de Bernier back out into the countryside. They hiked to Concord in disguise on March 20th. They confirmed the same information as the local spy. On April 14th, General Gage received new orders from London, written January 27th. Lord Dartmouth didn't merely authorize military action now, he told the general he had to act. The orders specified, furthermore, that the first and essential step would be to arrest the principal actors and abettors of the Provincial Congress. But Gage didn't move to arrest anyone. He wasn't tracking John Hancock or Samuel Adams or any other patriots. His intelligence files and his orders showed that he was completely focused on cannon and on Concord. Why not Worcester, where the Congress had more weapons and supplies? Well, it was farther away, it was harder to send troops to, but he didn't have a source in the town. But I argue that the most important thing was that he knew that the brass cannon were in Concord. Again, the Concord spy confirmed that to Gage in mid-April. As around the same time he was receiving these orders from London that it was time for him to act. Seizing those field pieces would require a march deep into hostile territory. 17 miles to Concord, another 2 across the North Bridge to Barrett's farm. But if that mission succeeded, it would erase the embarrassment of having let those cannon get away in the first place. General Gage drafted orders to Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith, and the top item he wanted the regulars to look for was 4 brass cannon and 2 mortars or cohorns in the cellar or outhouse of Mr. Barrett, a little the other side of the bridge. Already, however, the Barretts had started moving their supplies to neighboring towns. Colonel Barrett's grandson, James, then 14 years old, recalled how he and other boys with oxen and cart removed the stores deposited at the house of his grandfather into the woods and concealed them, a cartload at a time, under pine boughs. And to speed the movement, the grandson said in 1848, the lads would march on either side of the oxen and goad them into a trot. So in the middle of April 1775, in the backwoods of Concord, you would see boys poking their oxen into a trot along the black woods. Gage took steps to stop the Patriots from sending out alarm messages. He put mounted officers on the roads out on April 18th, patrolling the roads between Charlestown and Concord so that nobody could get through, nobody could get ahead of the troops as it had happened in Salem. ironically, those riders were what alerted a lot of people that something was up, because they saw British Army riders coming through town, and in fact, in Lexington, the militiamen started to gather. After sunset on April 18th, 1775, about 800 British soldiers were rowed quietly across the Charles River. This was more than twice as many as went to Charlestown in 1774 or Salem in February 1775, but that expedition to Concord was too late to catch Massachusetts' cannon. And on the road to Concord, those British soldiers would come across the Lexington militia lined up on their common, and there would be shooting, and this time, for the first time, people would be killed. And by the end of the afternoon, the Massachusetts militia regiments were once again converging on Boston, having heard rumors, this time correct, that British troops had killed locals, and that was when we say the war officially began, and that is why I say that 4 stolen cannon ignited the Revolutionary War. Thank you.